Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Last year I released an interview, audio only, with Dr. Paul Reeve. Unfortunately my camera cut out, but I've decided to add some still photos and for the first time release it on YouTube. We're getting a lot of YouTube subscribers, so thank you so much for watching us here on YouTube. In our next conversation with Dr. Paul Reeve, we'll talk about Brigham Young's declaration in the 1852 legislature that black men couldn't hold the priesthood. It's a very important part of the ban, and we'll find out what led to that statement. It turns out that Apostle Orson Pratt, you've probably heard of his brother Parley P. Pratt, made a very surprising statement in the 1852 legislature concerning black voting rights. This is before the Civil War. It's an amazing conversation with Paul, and I think you'll really love it. Check it out. I also want to mention that we're trying to set up some classes here at Gospel Tangents on Mormon history, and I'd like you to sign up for to just talk to me about what's most interesting to you in Mormon history, science, and theology. If you could sign up at tinyurl.com/y8pdzj88, then you can have a conversation with me, just about 20 or 30 minutes. I'd like to find out what you're most interested in with Mormon history. Please sign up, and for the first 7 people who sign up, I will give a free transcript of any of our interviews that we've released so far. So please check that out. Now back to our conversation. All right, well, I want to jump back to 1840s, 1850s time period. You gave a presentation at Mormon History Association a year or two ago. I don't remember when. I think it was Eugene Carruth and
Christopher Rich.
Christopher Rich.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So that was a fascinating presentation, and I have to tell you that following that presentation, I became a fanboy of Orson Pratt.
Uh-huh.
So I think this is one of the not well-told stories of his opposition to Brigham Young concerning slavery and even black voting, which I think would blow most people's minds. And then in 1852, as he's explaining about slavery, which I want to talk a little bit about slavery being legalized in Utah, that's where he talks about one drop, as I recall. Are you familiar? Am I telling it right?
Well, Wilford, if you go with Wilford Woodruff's very truncated attempt at capturing Brigham Young's speech in his journal, then Woodruff will insert the language of one drop into Brigham Young's speech. But if you go with George Watt, who captures a speech in Pitman shorthand, George Watt does not have Brigham Young using the one-drop language.
Oh, that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
And I know you've warned me about that before,
Yeah.
but I still have a problem with that.
Yeah. So for the book, I was able to get back to the Pitman shorthand version of Brigham Young's speeches for the legislative session. And I believe that we shouldn't rely upon Woodruff's very shortened, truncated version. Imagine kind of capturing our conversation, trying to capture it in longhand versus a court stenographer, trying to capture it. And Pitman shorthand isn't as precise as a court stenographer, but nonetheless more precise than trying to capture it in longhand. And Woodruff captures around 800 words, and Watt captures something like 2,400 words, and so 3 times as many. And I think much more precise in capturing what Brigham Young is saying, and Watt does not include the language of one drop. And so in the documentary history that we're producing, going to try to make the case that scholars should rely upon the Watt version over the Woodruff version.
I can't tell you how excited I am to see that book. So let's talk a little bit more about slavery in Utah. So you've got this debate in 1950, 51, I believe, in the Utah legislature about whether we should allow slavery in Utah. I believe Charles Rich, one of the apostles, had some slaves. So obviously there were some apostles who wanted to do slavery. But you have Orson Pratt, who he didn't seem like he was in favor of that. So can you talk a little bit about that debate and how it turned out?
Sure. So Orson Pratt gives a speech in opposition to the what comes to be called the Servant Code that's being debated by the legislature in 1852. What laws will govern the black slaves who have been brought to Utah Territory by their white slave masters? That's what they're trying to determine in the 52 legislative session. And in doing research for the book, came across then these speeches that had never been transcribed from Pittman shorthand, and so haven't been a part of the historical record as historians have written about these events in the past. And the LDS Church History Library was kind enough to have Legine Caruth transcribe them and allow me to use them in the research for the book. So Orson Pratt gives a speech where he simply speaks out very strongly against the bill that the legislature is debating. He speaks out strongly against slavery. He says if the Utah Territory legalizes slavery, it will put a black mark on the territory. A variety of countries were emancipating their slaves, outlying slavery. The British Empire had already done so. Obviously, the U.S. had not. But Pratt said this will harm our missionary efforts when we go abroad if people become aware that as countries are getting rid of slavery, we're legalizing it. He says we should reject the bill outright, and says that if Utah Territory does this, the angels in heaven will blush. He's very strong in his notion of why this is wrong. He argues that curses are not multi-generational. So God may very well curse a people, but it's only that people. It doesn't pass down from generation to generation. So he's rejecting the notion of a multi-generational curse that might impact, if black people truly are the descendants of Cain, that doesn't matter to Orson Pratt because curses are not multi-generational. It would only apply to the generation that God cursed, not to however many generations later. So it's a very singular kind of position that he stakes out in Mormonism, and ultimately he doesn't win the day, but he is speaking out against Brigham Young, and they are butting heads in that legislative session. I think they butt heads again over the election bill. So the election bill is also being debated that legislative session. And we know that Orson Pratt speaks on February 4th because the evidence within one of Brigham Young's speeches tells us that he does, but unfortunately that speech is not recorded. I would love to know what Orson Pratt says on February 4th. Because Brigham Young will say on February 4th, no one got up to speak until Pratt got up to speak, and he only got up to speak to stick his thumb into me. Okay? So we know that Pratt spoke on February 4th, and we know that he's aiming at Brigham Young because Brigham Young tells us that that's the case. Then Brigham Young, and they're debating the election bill. Who's going to be able to vote in Utah Territory?
Let me just interrupt you for a second. So Brigham Young at the time was serving as governor of Utah. What was Pratt's position?
Pratt was, so Brigham Young is serving as prophet as well as governor, and Pratt is serving as apostle as well as legislator. Okay. So you have these obviously mixed roles taking place. And they're butting heads. They butted heads before. They'll butt heads again, but they're diametrically opposed in this legislative session. And Brigham Young will give a speech the morning of 5th of February, and it's his most fully articulated race-based priesthood restriction. But it also is really helpful to know that he's arguing about the election bill, because within that race-based priesthood restriction, he's simply saying blacks will not rule over me in Utah Territory. Okay, so we're not going to give them the right to vote, and they will not rule over me in this church. We're not going to give them the priesthood. So those are the positions that he's staking out. And I really believe that he is speaking in opposition to Orson Pratt's speech February 4th, the day before. We don't have the speech, but when Brigham Young says in his 5th of February speech, if no other prophet said it before now, I say it, black people are the descendants of old Cain and are barred from the priesthood. He actually says he's striking out on his own, that if no other prophet said it before, I'm saying it now, right? So I am starting a new trajectory, right? I am distinguishing myself. And when I hear him say that, I imagine Orson Pratt the day before saying, no other prophet said this before. And this is Brigham Young's response, well, if no one ever said it before, I'm saying it now, right? That's the context. Obviously, I can't prove it because we don't have Pratt's speech, but I imagine that Brigham Young is obviously speaking to Pratt, and we know that in the context of the speech that in fact he is. I mean, we know that Pratt spoke the day before and that they are in a heated debate. So how does Pratt push back? So the minutes of the legislature tell us that that afternoon of February 5th, after Brigham Young has given this very strong speech, there are two bills that are introduced that are just innocuous bills, like who cares? It's the Cedar City and Fillmore municipal bills, where they're just approving them as legal municipal entities. But within the bills are the voting rights for Fillmore and Cedar City. Who gets to vote in Fillmore and Cedar City? And they stipulate that white men over 21 get to vote. And that's par for the course for the nation in 1852. Pratt votes against both of those bills. And the minutes tell us that he does so because they don't allow black men to vote. And I believe that's his effort at, again, pushing back against Brigham Young. So Brigham Young got to have his say in the morning, and this is Pratt's way of responding. I'm going to vote against these two municipal bills to make my point that I believe black men should be allowed to vote in Utah Territory.
No, to me, that is absolutely astonishing, because this is the year 1852. This is pre-Civil War.
That's right.
I mean, how did Pratt fit in with the rest of America as far as a black man should be allowed to vote? Because I can't imagine that was a popular position.
It's really not. I mean, there are a few people who are arguing for this, radical abolitionists. But like I said, this is just a radical minority. To stake out that kind of position, you would be branded as a radical minority, marginalized from the mainstream. It really is kind of a distinct position, and for him to be making it in Utah Territory really is quite unique for 1852. Not many are advocating for black suffrage in 1852.
I mean, when did blacks were they allowed to vote?
Well, so remember you have the 15th Amendment, which is passed following the Civil War, and I don't remember. That's going to make me look bad. I don't remember what year that's actually ratified, but it's one of the three amendments that come out of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment eradicates slavery, 14th Amendment is civil rights, and then the 15th Amendment is black suffrage. But it's
so 1860s, 1870s.
Yeah,
and that's good enough.
Exactly. Yep.
But even still, blacks still had the problem with voting because we still have the 1962 Voting Rights Act. So can you just fill me in there? What was going on in that 80 years or whatever?
Sure. So Reconstruction, how do you put the nation back together, sort of dominates American politics after the Civil War. And you have radical Republicans in Congress who are in favor of black suffrage, and that is finally passed with the 15th Amendment. And there is a period of time where blacks enjoy that right to vote. And you have the first black senators elected to the United States Senate during that Reconstruction period. But then there's going to be the backlash in the South, the reassertion of white supremacy. And the KKK becomes really the paramilitary arm of the Democratic Party. And if you vote the Republican ticket, you're subject to intimidation by the KKK, you're subject to violence and subject to death, especially black people. And so in essence, the KKK and then black codes that start to be written, poll taxes, a variety of ways, literacy tests that start to be incorporated in the South, strip that right away from blacks in the South. And so you have Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, black codes being written across the South. Obviously, federal troops are all withdrawn from the South in 1877. And so as historians, we see that as the end of the Reconstruction era. And when the troops are gone, you have no one left to enforce the laws that have been passed. And so Southern whites just simply regain white supremacy, regain control, segregate blacks, and in every way possible, strip rights that were granted to them as a result of the 14th and 15th Amendments, strip them from them. And you have the Supreme Court that puts its stamp of approval on that in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And so racial segregation then takes over, and therefore you need the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s, and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s as a result.
Wow, that's great. So going back to Orson Pratt, like I said there, I am just so amazed that in 1952 he was making such an amazing thing. And from what I understand, this speech has not been known until a year or two ago. Is that correct?
That's correct.
At least among historians.
That's right. That's right. Because it was George Watt never did transcribe it himself, and so it stayed in his papers only in Pittman shorthand form. And there are a few people left on the planet that can read Pittman shorthand, and one of them works for the LDS Church History Library, Jean Carruth. And she's been going through a lot of these Pittman speeches and transcribing them, but it takes a long time. And it was only when I made a request for my book to see if there was a Pittman shorthand version of Brigham Young's speech, because I wanted to get as close to his original words as possible, that it led to the discovery of these other speeches from the legislative session.
Wow.
Yeah.
So do you wish Orson Pratt was more well known among modern Mormons?
Well, of course, for that speech, especially. I mean, obviously, there may be some things that Orson Pratt did and said that might cause us pause, but certainly the position that he stakes out in 1852, I wish that was more well known, and that really Brigham Young's position comes out of a debate, right? Debate with Orson Pratt. Over a legislative bill, right? This is not sort of a context that Believing Latter-day Saints would suggest is conducive for a revelation, right? That Brigham Young is sort of experiencing some sort of divine intervention here, but in fact he's engaging in a debate with an apostle legislator. And he is articulating his most forceful position on a racial priesthood restriction in that debate.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm just so amazed. I think that's one of the coolest episodes of Mormon history I've ever heard.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed this re-release of Dr. Paul Reeve's interview that we did last year. I've got another segment that I want to release also, where I put Paul on the hot seat.
You're hitting all the hot button issues. You're not letting me off easy here.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure that you like our page on facebook.com/gospeltangents. You can subscribe at youtube.com/gospeltangents. We're also on Twitter @gospeltangents, as well as make sure that you subscribe on iTunes so you don't miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some more of our videos. Thanks again.